just okay, quickly. Probably some of you know I'm a crazy Apple Newton collector. So our group finally finished the documentary. So for those of you who are interested a little in old Apple and maybe Newton, can be interesting. So the video is available on Vimeo, and I'm gonna show you only the quick trailer. Okay, thank you very much. The movie is quite interesting because we have, for example, interview with ex-CEO, Apple ex-Apple CEO John Scully. He's kind of like a father for the Newton, and Newton is of course protoplast grandfather for all tablets now. Yeah, so I think that documentary can be interesting for you. Thank you.
Yeah, you can probably close that. Right, so for the first talk of the evening, we're going to have Tim talk to us about AI. Tim, take it away.
Okay, thanks, Marius. Is this microphone working? You can hear me. Brilliant, nice one. So I'm going to start off by saying a little bit about me so that you understand how I've come to be talking about this subject. I did a master's and a PhD here in Edinburgh in artificial intelligence in the 1990s. And from the time of my PhD around the mid-90s, my primary interest has been in the field of artificial life. Some of you have probably never heard of that. What it is it's the attempt to build systems with lifelike properties. So that includes intelligence, AI as part of it, but also things like evolution, self-reproduction, self-maintenance, self-repair, and all those kinds of processes. I've been moving in and out between academic research and commercial companies for most of my career, but I'm currently taking some time out to develop a few ideas by myself in this kind of area, which may or may not turn into commercial things, but we'll see what happens. But I've also been busy writing a book in the last few years. It wasn't going to be a book, it was just going to be a short journal article about how a few people a long time ago were thinking about complex machines and how machines getting more and more intelligent might influence the future of society. But it's kind of expanded and turned into a book. So that's really what I'm going to talk about today. So the main things I'm talking about are self-reproduction and evolution of AI. And so by self-reproduction, I mean a machine, which could be a mechanical machine, but it could equally well be a nanobot or a molecular machine, engineered bacterium, or it could be a software self-reproducing virus or any other kind of agent that can reproduce itself without having, within an environment, without having someone else have to go in there and make another copy. And evolution, so if you add evolution to a self-reproducing machine, the extra thing you have to have is the ability for that machine to make a slight variant of itself, and for that variant to then be able to make an exact copy of the variant. So it needs heritable variation. And if you've got both of those things, then you can have things that can evolve and potentially become more complex. So as I'm going to talk about just now, these were key themes in very early thought, and I'm talking hundreds of years ago about how machine intelligence might influence society. But you might be forgiven for not having heard or thought much about these in the context of current AI, because they really aren't a focus of mainstream AI at the moment. But that's beginning to change. I certainly know people in some of the big tech companies in the US who are certainly thinking about the sorts of things I'll be talking about. And as I'll argue, I think it's going to become a more significant theme of future research. So, to put what I'm about to say in some context, of course, the history of humans trying to build lifelike automata or machines with some kind of properties of living systems goes back a very long way. It's about 3,000 years or more. This is my very quick, rough and ready, incomplete sketch of some of that history. Things in green are myths, but things in white are systems where there's actually documented evidence that those systems were actually built in practice. So the history of lifelike automata goes back a very long way. But for the purposes of my book and this talk, I'm focusing on this little area here and something much more specific. So as I said, not lifelike automata in general, but self-reproducing machines. The history of that you can really trace back to the early 1600s, where René Descartes popularized the view that animals could be understood purely as physical devices or natural automata. And so that raised the idea, not in Descartes, but various people after him, that, well, if animals are automata and animals can reproduce, maybe other kinds of automata, such as machines, can reproduce as well. So we talk about that history in the book, but today I'm going to be even more specific still and talk about this little bit here, around about 1850s to 1950s. And this is when people started talking about reproduction and evolution on top of that. So what happened for people to start thinking about those subjects at this time is really the confluence of two further significant events. One was the climax of the British Industrial Revolution in the early 1800s. And at that time, people were already starting to think, wow, these machines are getting very complicated, and it's every year they seem to be able to do more and more stuff. What's going to be the ultimate end state of all of this? How's it going to affect humanity in the long run? So in 1844, the British author and future Prime Minister, Benjamin Disraeli, I mean, many of you may not realize he was an author. I didn't before I found this. He wrote a novel called Coningsby, and in that, there was a chapter describing the industrial landscape of Manchester in the early 1800s. And there's a passage in there where he says, "And why should one say that the machine does not live? It breathes, it moves, and has it not a voice? And yet the mystery of mysteries is to view machines making machines, a spectacle that fills the mind with curious and even awful speculation." So I think it's incredible that people in the early 1800s were thinking about that, but they certainly were. And so coming on top of the Industrial Revolution comes the next big event, which was the publication of Darwin's The Origin of Species, which happened in 1859. And we really don't have to wait long at all after that until we find people combining all of these ideas together. So animals are machines, so machines may be able to do the sorts of things that animals can do, machines can reproduce, and animals can evolve, so maybe machines can evolve. So in fact, within 20 years of the publication of The Origin of Species, we see at least 3 people talking explicitly and at length about exactly this, about machines that can reproduce and evolve and become more intelligent. The first person to do this was Samuel Butler, who was a British author, but he emigrated to New Zealand in 1859. He was 22 years old at the time. He stayed there for about 5 years, set up a sheep farm, and was hoping to make money in the establishing colonies in New Zealand. But he was also an academic. He had some family connections to the Darwin family. And shortly after arriving in New Zealand, he read The Origin of Species. And that was really to inspire a lot of his later writing. So the first thing that he wrote on this subject, because he was in New Zealand, it was a letter to the local New Zealand newspaper, the Press in Canterbury, Christchurch, Canterbury. And here's a copy of the front page of that paper. On the left is the full front page, on the right is a zoom in, and you can see the date up here, Saturday, June 13th, 1863. And at the bottom of the second column here is Butler's letter, which is called Darwin Among the Machines. So 1863, some local newspaper in New Zealand publishing this. In this, Butler made the observation that machines were becoming more sophisticated and getting more control of self-regulation and self-acting. And he thought, well, if machines aren't encumbered by human inefficiencies, as he saw it, like consciousness or emotion, they will eventually outcompete us in many of our tasks, and will become the acme of all that the best and wisest man can ever dare to aim at, is what he said. But he thought, well, maybe, but they'll still be reliant upon humans for feeding them, repairing them, and producing their offspring. But, he said, it's true that even that machinery is, even at this present time, employed in begetting machinery and becoming the parent of machines. So the same idea as Disraeli, machines making machines. And he went on to think, well, at some point these reproductive organs of the machines might become developed in a manner which we are hardly yet able to conceive. So he was thinking that eventually they might be able to reproduce completely by themselves without any human interaction. So he really spent the rest of his career struggling with this idea, with basically the insight that the logic as laid out by Darwin in The Origin of Species there's nothing in that logic which restricts it to applying to biological organisms, but you could apply it to machines and technology as well. So in some of his further writing, he was quite enthusiastic and thought it might be a good thing that humans and machines might evolve cooperatively, and machines helping humans to become more powerful, more intelligent than they would otherwise be. In other cases, he wasn't quite as enthusiastic and thought that maybe machines would just ditch humans and become the intelligent species on the planet and drive us to extinction. And he wasn't the only person thinking that kind of thing at that time. I'll just give you one other quote from George Eliot, who's the pen name of the British author Mary Ann Evans. So in her last published work, published in 1879, she had a chapter which talked about very similar themes to Butler's. So machines becoming more intelligent. She was concerned with the social implications, so she thought it would drive humans unemployed, starting with the lowest skilled workers, but eventually making all humans unemployed and driving us to extinction. And like Butler, she thought, well, if they're not encumbered with consciousness or emotion or sensitivity. They don't even have to use verbal communication to get things done. Then they would probably outcompete us. And she wrote this passage. And thus this planet may be filled with beings who will be blind and deaf as the inmost rock, yet will execute changes as delicate and complicated as those of human language and all the intricate web of what we call its effects. Without sensitive impression, without sensitive impulse, there may be, let us say, mute orations, mute rhapsodies, mute discussions, and no consciousness there even to enjoy the silence. So again, that was pretty startling that people in the 1800s were thinking about these things and had these concerns. Okay, so moving on a bit, I'm going to skip some of these and jump to the next really rich vein of thought on this subject, which you can find with the emergence of the early American pulp sci-fi genre in the 1920s. So from the 20s onwards, for the next few decades, there are lots of examples of sci-fi stories that explore this idea of machines evolving and competing against humans. These are just a few of them. I will just give you a flavor of one of them. So this was John Campbell, who was an influential sci-fi editor as well as an author. He wrote a story in 1932 called The Last Evolution. And again, he's considering that machines are going to take over the world and drive humans to extinction. So there's a passage in there where it's the last two humans on Earth talking about their impending doom. And they say, I think that this is the end of man, but not the end of evolution. The children of men still live. The machines will go on, not of man's flesh, but of a better flesh, a flesh that knows no sickness and no decay, a flesh that spends no thousands of years in advancing a step in its full evolution, but overnight leaps ahead in new heights. So this is kind of interesting and is an example of one of the reasons why I think it's valuable to look at these things, because they're looking, okay, so they think that machines are going to take over the world, but don't necessarily view it as a bad thing, but instead there's some kind of suggestion that it can be seen more as a natural step in the biological process of evolution, and that machines will be our natural successors. So certainly looking at all of these old stories, I think it's interesting to look at the different kind of themes that come out of it and relate it to the kind of discussions of AI that are going on just now. And there's a lot of stuff in this early work that isn't really talked about now and maybe should be. Right, I was going to leave it there. I just want to say something about John Burnell, at the risk of overrunning. He was a distinguished scientist, but also wrote stories about the implications of science for society. And he wrote a small novel in 1929 in which he tried to set out what you could say from a scientifically defensible point of view about the long-term future of humanity. And he thought as the population grew, we would inevitably run out of resources, of energy and food, and would be driven to exploring other planets. And so, okay, hang on. And so he thought we would build spaceships which would act as sort of artificial planets in which we could send out colonies and use as a means of living and maybe exploring other parts of the solar system and the galaxy. But he said a globe such as that, which was merely a satisfactory way of continuing life indefinitely, would barely be more than a reproduction of terrestrial conditions in a more restricted sphere. So the essential positive activity of this globe would be that in the development, growth, and reproduction of the globe. So he thought that not just we would be building spaceships which we could live on, but that these spaceships would actually be able to build more spaceships by mining materials from asteroids and other planets, and that would be the only way in which we could really, in the long term, build a future for the human race off the planet Earth. I should say that was 1929. Other people since then have really developed that idea. So that's really been taken up. So that's really most of what I want to talk about just now. But just to flash over what has happened since then, these subjects, self-reproducing machines and evolving machines, it really took off in the 1950s with the introduction of the digital computer and also development of theory. So John von Neumann, who's obviously one of the founding fathers of computers, was also a founding father of the theory of self-reproducing automata. And he produced work in the 1950s that showed it was indeed possible to build a machine that could reproduce, and there wasn't any sort of logical infinite regress involved. But not only that, he demonstrated how you could build a machine that could build something more complicated than itself. Because if you think about usual manufacturing machines, normally their output is less complicated than the machine itself. But von Neumann showed that that wasn't necessarily the case. In the 1950s, we also see the first implementations of self-reproducing machines, both in software and in hardware. In software, Neil Sparacelli was working in von Neumann's group at Princeton and did some pioneering work in 1953, and moving on from there, on evolving agents. And he found all sorts of interesting properties like parasites, cooperative structures, mutations, all sorts of interesting dynamics that he observed in his tiny little computational system, which is all he could, all the computing power could cope with back then. And Lionel Penrose, who's the father of the physicist Roger Penrose, did some work with little wooden models which are based upon the idea of DNA reproduction. But he did a series of getting progressively more complicated wooden models which were able, if you fed them parts, they were able to exactly reproduce the series of coded information on those models. But they're sort of toy systems, but since then, work's really developed. Just to give you a few highlights, in 1980, NASA paid for a research group to study the possibility of having self-reproducing machines that would go to the moon or to asteroids or other planets and mine resources to be sent back to Earth for human use. Of course, the advantage and attraction of doing that would be that you would only have to send one machine to the moon, and then if it could reproduce itself, it could set up a whole colony or manufacturing colony of these things. So you could, having designed one of them, you could get a whole sort of infinitely larger scale production happening at no additional, not having to send anything additional up into space. Of course, if you're talking about physical machines that can reproduce in an open environment, there's a lot of potential for environmental catastrophe if these things are grabbing resources from the environment which they need to reproduce. So there's been work as well in the last 20 years on developing guidelines for research in this area, responsible research in self-reproducing and evolving technology. And you see continuing work even up to just last year. There's a paper published by some people in NASA looking at the practical difficulties of doing this. And the more we find about resources available on the moon and asteroids, the more possible and plausible it's seeming that it might actually be possible to do this kind of thing at some point. So that's self-reproducing machines. In terms of more software-based stuff and evolving machines, there's been a big sort of line of work in evolutionary computing and genetic algorithms, which some of you have probably heard about, which have produced some very impressive results. But these are mostly aimed at optimizing a particular problem. So you give it a problem and your system evolves some solution to it. In contrast to the kind of stuff that other people were talking about earlier, which is more of an open-ended system where things can evolve by themselves and potentially get more complex, but potentially get out of control as well. There's also a field called evolutionary robotics, where people evolve controllers and even the body of robots. Most of this at this stage happens in simulations. So you run an evolutionary algorithm on a simulation of the robot and then transfer the resulting controller to a real robot. But there's people are starting to use 3D printers and to do this actually in the robot itself and skipping the simulation stage. And then there's a whole field of artificial life, which I'm associated with, addressing many of these topics, but it's still a relatively small field compared to AI. I just got back from the A-Life conference in Japan. There were 400 people there or so. So it's not a tiny conference, and it's growing. But I think in the coming years, there's more of these ideas are going to become relevant to mainstream AI. And that's what I'm just going to finish off with. So what are the distinctive properties? Why would people who are currently doing mainstream AI want to start thinking about this kind of stuff? Well, if you're talking about machines that can reproduce and evolve, it's a creative process, and it's possible of evolving more and more complex solutions. They are the two, I think, main selling points of this stuff. So in terms of creativity, people talk about open-ended evolution. So when I talked about genetic algorithms just then, and they're aimed at solving a particular problem, people working in open-ended evolution are working with self-reproducing machines that evolve and generally put them into some sort of environment, which will be maybe a virtual world, and just let them evolve naturally, like like life has evolved on Earth. So you give them resources, you allow them to compete with each other, and just see what happens. And so there's a potential for that to be a much more creative process, because in the biological world, things haven't just solved particular problems, but biological life has been able to exploit more and more properties of the physical environment. So, for example, finding new modes of interaction, like the evolution of flight or the evolution of sight or hearing. So there's a possibility not of just solving a particular problem, but looking at the wider environment in which you are a part and making use of that to do new and interesting things and interact with other agents in interesting ways. And to put it in AI terms, you could say that biological evolution is a one-shot process that has created all of nature. If you think about it, it's just one process started 4 billion years ago, and everything, not just humans and human brains and intelligence and all of that, but everything you see in nature has been created by this biological evolutionary process. And so one of the key research issues here is what's missing from what we're doing at the moment that would really allow this sort of open-ended creative process to unfold. And also just the evolution of self-reproducing entities produces systems which have their own intrinsic drives, desires, and goals. So people talk about AGI, artificial general intelligence, and getting to human level intelligence and being able to solve all sorts of things. But one of the weaknesses of current AI is that it doesn't have any of its own goals. It doesn't want to do anything. It just does whatever you tell it to do. But it's not driven by any internal process. And so the process of evolution of self-reproducing machines that go through this filter of natural selection and evolution introduces intrinsic drive, so that the very sort of fundamental design of the agents is there because it has helped that agent survive and reproduce in its environment over evolutionary time. And so by doing these processes, that, I argue, is the way to get AI, which has its own intrinsic drives and goals, which may or may not be a good thing. So current AI is lacking that. I think that's going to be a key aspect of AGI. But whether we really want it or not is another question. Okay, this is my final slide. Okay, so it's true, we don't really see these large-scale self-reproducing machines at the moment, but there are plenty of other media where we could more quickly see this kind of stuff. Software, obviously, and this is particularly relevant when we're starting to see viruses now which are causing real-world damage, like the Stuxnet virus, which was designed to cause damage to nuclear power stations. Nanobots, chemical systems, engineering, bacteria. So there are all these systems which are being worked on just now, where it's much more, in the shorter term, it's easy to see this kind of thing being implemented. And so we better understand what the consequences are and how we might control it if necessary. So just a final point, I think, as I hope I've showed, that the history of the subject provides a rich resource of thought and ideas and discussion about these issues, dangers and consequences. But a lot of the current debate about AI completely ignores all of this, and I think that's a shame. And what I'm hoping to do, what I hope the book is going to do, is rectify that a little bit. And I think that's it. Further reading, there's a paper on my website. Our book is coming out probably next year sometime, but you can sign up for an announcement list of that. But that's it. Thank you.
Right. Does anyone have any questions?
Do you know if there's any effort to create software agents that actually trade with the wider economy, and then that's their fitness function? So they're trying to be economically independent and survive long term and reproduce if they're successful.
Yes, actually, I spent 4 years in a startup doing machine learning for hedge fund management, but we weren't doing self-reproducing agents. Is there any work? I think it's certainly something of interest. I'm not aware of any. So there's certainly work on evolving agents in financial situations and environments, but in terms of letting them loose and having them self-reproduce, I think, yeah, there's too much capacity for that to get out of control. Not that that normally stops bankers, but yeah.
But they still need to be profitable, I suppose.
Yes, yeah. So I mean, I've thought of that. I think it would be a really good test case. You probably wouldn't want to invest real money in it for a while, but it definitely would be a good test case of that would be their fundamental resource, how making money, and so I think it's an interesting area from an academic point of view. Maybe a bit frightening if you're doing it seriously.
You were talking about evolution and reproduction together. Isn't that likely to be pretty much catastrophic where any attempt at the alignment problem is concerned?
Sorry, you have to explain what the alignment problem is.
Basically making sure that AIs or reproducing machines desires align with those of humankind.
Oh, right.
You know, almost by definition, you look
Yes.
you look at the natural world, and it's a mess out there.
Yeah.
Everything's eating everything else. Everything parasites off everything else.
Yeah.
You know, we think we're great. The vegetarians go, we're great. What are we doing? Well, we're eating these other reproducing machines over there. It looks extremely dangerous to me. What's your thought on that?
Yes, it is. No, that's why institutions like the Foresight Institute are working on guidelines for responsible development of this technology. I think there's an emerging research field in open-ended evolution, as I talked about, which is trying to capture this power of creativity and ongoing generation of novel solutions to problems. So I think there are chunks of this technology that you could develop very profitably and would be very interesting to do in a safe manner. There are, so it is fundamentally, potentially a very dangerous thing. There's quite a lot of work, which I haven't really talked about how you can mitigate that and how you can retain some control. So particularly for some of the work in NASA and talking about the sending self-replicating machines up to Mars and the moon and whatever, they've thought a lot about that and how you can ensure that there is also always some switch that can be pulled if things go wrong. And mostly they see self-replication is good, but evolution is bad. And exactly as you pointed out, having the two together, particularly in a physical system, could potentially be catastrophic, yeah. In a software system, which is what I'm interested in, I see it as a way of creating virtual worlds which have really amazing life evolving in it. But in hardware, yeah, there are much more serious issues, and it is definitely a serious problem.
I'm minded of there's always an XKCD, right? There's a classic XKCD that says if nanobots get out of control, they'll run out of IPv6 addresses at about 40% of the globe.
Yes. Yeah, that might save us.
Right, okay. Thank you, Tim. We're going to have a 5-minute break, and then we're going to have the second talk. So, yeah, it's your time for a break if you need it. Thank you. Evening. We're gonna have Greg. Please subscribe to our channel here. I don't know. We've got a live chat thing going. So yeah, Greg, go for it.
Right, okay, cool. So this is the real title of my talk. That's the title I have to put out publicly. This one is the real title, or this one possibly as well. So basically, this is a rant about communication. So I'm a community manager. I run an online community. But I'm not just talking about online communities. We're all part of communities, right? Who's in a community? All of you, good, yes, because our family, our friends, these are communities. Our colleagues are a community. All of our hobbies probably have communities, unless you're really solitary. I just do pottery in a shed. No. And our locality, I mean, my village has like a village council, right? So we get funding to do our village action plan and all the rest of it. And there's tons more as well, right? So we're all in many, many communities. And most of those communities are physical. We're all right here tonight. And physical has less of a problem with communication because we've evolved to deal with it that way. We're visual, we deal with cues, we don't do well with just written communication. And that's where it gets to a problem. We have to communicate. If we don't communicate, we're not a community, we're just a lot of people doing things individually. So communication's key, but we're not actually very good at it, particularly online. Online communities are very weird and strange things because we lose all of that other information. We just have the text, and we turn out to be really, really bad at this, and then doubly bad when you factor in other nationalities or other continents. Even worse when you factor in time zones. Who's been to a meeting for one of their communities? It's always physical, right? And then I hear it all the time. Let's all get together and talk about this. Let's have a conference. No. Because then you've just excluded like 70% of your community who can't make it, right? It's like, how are you actually going to make decisions and include everyone and make people want to be a part of your community if you're not actually involving them, or you're just taking the people who can actually afford to turn up? This is a bit of a problem, right? So I have a real problem with communication because it's really hard to do right. And really the take-home message I want you to get from this night, if you do nothing, if you fall asleep now or you have to leave because we're overrunning, the message is this: for whatever communities you're in, think really carefully about what tooling you use for your communication, because it really, really matters. It's really easy to go with the defaults. It's really easy to go with what everyone else does, which is nearly always mailing lists when you talk about online stuff, right? And it's not always a good choice. There are definitely communities where mailing lists work. I do not expect the Linux kernel development to stop using a mailing list anytime soon. But there are definitely communities where that's not the case. The other thing you've got to watch out for is channel fragmentation. And this is the other take home, really, is that not only do you have to think about tools, pick one. When I started my job as a community manager, my boss was like, we need to be on Facebook and LinkedIn and Slack and IRC and this and this and this. And so, no, stop. Terrible idea. For a start, every one of those adds like 30% to my workload, forget it. But it's just a bad idea. You're fragmenting knowledge, you're fragmenting the community. These people over here don't talk to these people over here. You're repeating the same answers, your support burden is huge. Stop doing it. Figure out what is important, pick the best tool for that. Now, I'm not saying you should have one and one only. There are different types of communication. You know, I definitely think at a minimum you should have a real-time thing because people want to chat. It's how we form networks, it's how we form personal communication and connections. But that's not a good way to take decisions. As we've just said, you have to worry about things like time zones. If you're going to take decisions on Slack, then there are people who are not there right now. And then they're never going to see that, and they're going to feel left out, disenfranchised. They don't want to be part of your community anymore. So you need asynchronous communication as well. That's where something like the mailing list comes in. But mailing lists have a problem, as I'm about to get to. So you've got to figure out what's right for your community and have a good think about that, and then pick the right tool for each of the channels. Right? You're going to have more than one channel, yes, but stick to one thing. Pick your social media, pick your real-time communication, pick your asynchronous communication. You may have others depending on your community. I would say those three are pretty common. Not everyone's going to do the social media thing. Right, here's an example of this in practice. So that's the rant, and you'll see why I don't like mailing lists in a minute. Now the history lesson. The Foreman is the community that I work on, I get paid to work on. And as of 2017, this is what our mailing list traffic looked like. So this goes back to sort of early 2014, and we had a nice high point in sort of 2015, and by here we're back down to 2014 again. And I saw this, I'm the community lead, right? I look at this and I'm like, crap, that's not good. I don't like seeing that, my community is shrinking. Okay, wait, let's not panic, maybe there's some interpretations, data, let's think about data, confounding variables. Maybe we all move to real-time communication. Maybe we're all on IRC now. Nope. That's the IRC logs for roughly the same period. Well, actually, only from 2016, but anyway. Not an improvement, I have to say. Community looks even smaller now. Okay, well, most of our community are asking for help. Our project's quite complex. Maybe we just fixed all the bugs and have really good documentation now? Not really. This is our bug tracker. And okay, it has gone down a little bit, but not really, let's face it. So as a result of that, I looked at this and I thought, I've got to do something. I'm supposed to be the community manager, right? What do I do about this? I'm going to have a think about this. And so I spent some time thinking about this and I thought, well, what are the problems? Where do I think the problem lies? And there's some corollaries that you don't see in the graphs. It's that things like, we're quite good at getting developers in who work on the system side of the project. We're terrible at getting people to work on the UI. What's going on there? Why should that be not more of an even distribution, right? Why can we not find anyone who's prepared to help us develop our UI? Also, we had problems with things like decision making. We talked a little bit about trying to take decisions just a moment ago. We're really bad at that. I would attribute some of that to the fact that we're using a mailing list because there's not a lot of rich support. You have these communication problems. It's difficult to take decisions there because you don't have a lot of tooling to help you. And so I spent some time thinking about this, and I decided we were going to go to a forum. This was a contentious decision. I spent 4 weeks arguing with the community about this. To be fair, I'm dramatizing that. Most of them were quite supportive. There were a number of the old guard who were very, very not in favor of this. But I did a poll, and then I weighted it by how long people have been in the community, and it was still like 63% in favor of doing it. So fantastic. So we did this. We did this at start of January this year. And it turns out forum's really right for our community. Just to mention Discourse briefly, as an implementation of a forum, it's lovely. If you've not already seen Discourse, well, you probably have. Here's just a few examples of people I've seen using Discourse. I also missed off Docker and Kubernetes, which I meant to put on there. And there's a whole ton of other communities as well. I find a new one almost every week that's using Discourse. But it's open source, so it can be branded very easily, so you don't always see the word Discourse in it. But once you've seen one Discourse site, you have seen all of them. And it looks real, and I go, oh, God, another one? So basically, Discourse as a forum is lovely. People ask me, what's the killer feature of Discourse? I'm like, there isn't one. It's just how a forum should be. Everything about it is beautifully engineered. After 2 years of using Discourse, because I was using it for a smaller community before I decided to do it for Foreman, I'm still finding new things, little things that you just go, oh, that's just how it should be. And it's like just tiny little things that are just perfect, and there's just hundreds of them. So you can't point to a killer feature. It's just a really, really good implementation of a forum. So we decided to go to Discourse, and the reasoning behind that was because if I think about my 2 user groups, if I think first of all about, I mentioned the problem with developers. Well, maybe if we want UI developers, maybe we should use something that UI people actually want to interact with, right? Potentially they don't like mailing lists, one possibility. We talked about decision making. Well, if you've got markdown support, rich text support, images, the ability to do polls, the ability to like things, then maybe you can have better discussions, right? If you're talking about support, well, you can tag things, you can mark questions as solved. You know, there's tooling there to help with your support load as well. And maybe just we're in a newer phase. Mailing lists has been around 30 years. Maybe it's time to try something a little newer, right? And I spoke to some of our community, and the sort of people that were coming, I'm nearly 40, I don't mind mailing lists. But maybe people coming out of university aren't quite so fond of them. There's also a barrier to entry. People don't like signing up for mailing lists. And we were seeing a very stark divide between the users' mailing list, which was mainly for support, and the developers' mailing list, which is for development. And nobody was crossing over to tell us their thoughts on how we were developing the project. That's a real problem when you're developing in an echo chamber, right? You're not necessarily solving your users' problems at this point. And so that was also an issue that I was concerned about. So I thought a forum would help with a lot of these things. And so we did it. And this is the data from June this year, 6 months after we did it. So the red lines are what you saw earlier. That's the 2017 data. The 2018 data is in blue. And it's reasonably good outcome. I'm pretty pleased with that. The reason it's split is because on the left here, you've got the support channel. This is the development channel. This is a graph for a blog post I did, and I just lifted it straight out. The others got done this afternoon. So this was interesting, but I wanted to go a little bit further. That's just raw counts of posts per week. But I also did this graph. Now, this one needs a little bit more explanation. Basically, this is the only interesting one. And what we've done here is we've accounted for the growth in users. I don't think it's not a massively interesting result to say that we have more posts if we have more users. I think that's fairly self-explanatory. It's still a good result. Like, I want my community to grow, right? So I'm still happy with that. But it's not very interesting. And so we can see here that in the users 2018 data, most of the variation is explained by having more users. And this line goes pretty much dead flat once you account for that. This one, on the other hand, is the development channel. And if we account for the users, that is to say, if we keep the users level, we make a thought experiment where there was no growth in the users, we still see an increase in posts over time. And that tells me the developers are talking more to each other. And so I'm very happy to see that one of the things we posited back in November when we started talking about this was that we would boost conversation between the developers and make it easier to make decisions. Now, I can't tell you that's not all arguments, right? But it's still a result I'm pretty happy with. And so overall, I've been very happy. There's a few other anecdotes that don't easily fit into a graph that I can tell you that I really liked about it. We did indeed see people crossing over from the users category to the development category to give thoughts on various issues and things that we're talking about on the development boards, which is great to see because we weren't seeing that on the mailing list. We have seen an increase in people willing to develop in certain areas of the project, although that's hard to quantify. But the most interesting one for me is a very, very tiny little anecdote. And it's the sort of thing you would never put on your pros as to why we should do this, right? And it's the ability to like posts. Sounds like the most trivial, facile thing. But as the community lead, I saw an argument between two of my most trusted and core developers a few weeks ago. It was getting pretty heated. But I bring you back to where I started. Communication is hard and it's easy to misinterpret text. But what I saw in discourse that I would never have seen on a mailing list was that they were liking each other's posts as they went down. And suddenly I realized that this is not an argument, it's a proper debate, and that they're not getting heated with each other, they're just robustly deciding what's the right way forward, and I don't need to step in and figure out what's going on here, right? Now, from my perspective as the community lead, that was a weight off my mind. And it's the tiniest little things like that that make forums really quite valuable, I think. And to be clear, for people who love mailing lists, you can still interact with discourse by emails. So, no, it's not a perfect mailing list, but it does a pretty good job. So that's a quick history lesson. I'm trying to go fast because I know we want to be out of here at 9 o'clock. So that's a really fast history lesson of one example of where we took a look at our communication channels and went, maybe we're not doing it right. I mean, Foreman's been around 9 years. That's 8 years of mailing list and slightly under 1 year of forums. And that's a huge impact on the community already. And everyone I've spoken to says the same thing, particularly the people who are against it. There's a trust level system built into discourse. And the person who was the most vocal opponent of the move was the first person to hit trust level 3. So I was really quite impressed with that. But I don't just, so I promised you a rant, a history lesson, and a sales pitch. So what about this community? Would it work for us? We're fragmented geographically. How many people know there are other tech meetups? Yeah, you should all know that because we said Tech Meetup Sterling at the start of the night, right? But we don't share resources. We've all got different mailing lists. Some of them have their own Slack channels. We're all starved of speakers. Glasgow had to pretty much shut down because they couldn't get speakers. But we're not sharing resources. We're not talking about who's been good, a speaker, who's prepared to travel. I would certainly be happy to go and speak in Dundee, Edinburgh, Glasgow, because I live right in the middle. I live near Stirling. So, it's no problem for me. But we're not talking, we're not sharing. You look at the mailing list, and really there's very little other than Maritz's post every month saying what talks are coming up, right? But that doesn't have to be like that. We all have interesting projects we're working on. Why are we not talking about them? This is just one facet of a very vibrant tech community within Edinburgh and Scotland as a whole. Where's the discussion? It's not happening, and I don't like that it's not happening because we're all really smart people. So we're fragmented, we have multiple mailing lists, there's no sharing of resources. Could we benefit from moving to a forum? Well, I've already built it for you. There we go. No. Where is it? Not that one. Did I close it? Have I closed it? I have, haven't I? I was just going to add it. I don't use Macs, right? Can you tell? Why is that not actually... Why is that not highlighting? There we go, I got it. So it's live now. You can go and register if you wish. Let me see, can I make this bigger? Yeah, that's good enough. Yeah, good enough. So basically, we've tried to orchestrate it reasonably well. There's a few things I haven't mentioned because I've gone really fast, but actually we've got a few minutes to spare, so this is good. Discourse does plugins, and I have added some to this one. Notably, it has an events plugin, which is really relevant to this community, right? So you can go here and you can see that there's TechMeetUp Edinburgh. Did you actually update this one? Nah, you're terrible. Let's go here. There we go. So it defaults to upcoming events, but if we go back here, you can see that we've got the one we had last week, and we can also go to a calendar view. I've got to stop doing that, but anyway. So there's a nice calendar view there. And a map view as well if you really care, but no one's put locations on recently. So, anyway. So we can do forecasting upcoming events. This is potentially much better for organizers because we don't need to do this whole GitHub process where you have to send a pull request to update the website, because we can just give the appropriate organizers the rights on the forum, right? If we look at the categories, so I've gone for your classics, your kind of off-topic, your tech talk, feedback on the site as a whole. We've got the events, so TechMeetUp Stirling, TechMeetUp Edinburgh, obviously I can add the other ones as well. We've got a speakers section, so if people want to offer talks or we're looking for talks, we've got an area to do that. I have indexed the Google group. So basically that's live. It's read-only, it's one way, but at least that way you don't have to lose out with the people who haven't moved over yet. There's potentially some talk there. And I can index other mailing lists as well. I'm talking with the Scotland group about getting their Linux user group mailing list index, and any others that are of interest are pretty easy to do as well. So there's lots of ways to use this. There's lots of interest. Not many users yet because we haven't publicized it particularly loudly, but we've been using this to organize TechMeetUp Stirling for the last 2 months, and I'm pretty happy with how it's going. I'm already running 2 other discourse sites, right? So a big deal for me. So lots of things there. I would welcome feedback. You can find me as this person with the hat on here. Is it going to work? No, it's going to do me a preview thing. There we go. You have to have been using Discourse for at least about 15 minutes before you're allowed to actually send private messages. There's an automated promotion system. You start out as trust level 0. That's a spam feature. Once you've read a couple of topics and spent a bit of time reading some posts, it'll automatically promote you to level 1. Then you can private message people. So by all means, message me directly. Or if for some reason you're not getting trust level 1, then you can just post it in the site category, the site feedback category as well, which is even at trust level 0, you can do that. Have a play with it. Tell me what you think. I think this is a good idea. I would like to see the other tech meetups get on board. There's a lot of good things to recommend it from an organizational perspective as well. I would potentially like to see other tech groups get involved as well. I don't see why not, really. But that's maybe for the future. We'll see. So that's kind of all I wanted to say about that. That's me. Thank you very much. Questions?
Right. Questions?
Very nice. I was just wondering, with your analysis of the trends in number of posts for email versus discussion board, I was wondering, was the size of the posts different? So the amount of content in each?
So a number of, I haven't analyzed it. There will almost certainly be some of that. There'll be quite a lot. You tend to get that, here's a huge proposal, yeah, fine, yeah, fine, yeah, fine, yeah, fine. Right. So that would be a good piece of analysis to do. I haven't done it, unfortunately. I do have another graph, which I can pull up, which at least shows like this, the whole set of what you did see together, so the users and the posts and the time. But the size of the post, no, I don't have any data set on that at the moment. Could I pull that up? No, not easily.
It would probably be good if there were smaller and sort of more fine-grained conversations.
Absolutely, I would agree. Yeah. I would agree because mailing lists I think tend to promote a larger post size. Generally speaking, you get the quicker reaction. I think the snappier kind of hot takes on a forum. But equally, the nice thing is obviously you've also got that liking functionality as well. So if all you want to do is I'm good with this, you can just hit the like button, right? So yeah, and we've seen a lot more of use of that than I expected, given the nature of our community and how we've come from a mailing list where that's not a thing. Actually, the uptake on that and things like using polls has been much higher than I expected, so that's really quite nice.
So you mentioned Slack on the first slide, how you hated that as well. So that's definitely transformed my collaborations I work in from our old Wiki plus mailing list.
Sure.
Huge improvement. So I wondered what your...
Okay, so let me be clear. I have no beef with real-time communication, no beef with wanting something that's shinier than IRC. Because I appreciate that's 30 years old and showing its age somewhat. But I do have a problem with a business model of we'll sell you access to your chat history. Use an open source one. There's plenty of good ones out there. Matrix would be my pick, but there's also Mattermost, there's Gitter, there's Rocket Chat, others. But yeah, Matrix would be my pick. It's really matured in the last couple of years. I'm using Matrix as my daily driver. I've bridged that to our Freenode IRC channel, so my team don't necessarily know that I'm not on IRC anymore. But you know, it works really, really nicely. It's got, I don't actually use Slack, obviously. I wouldn't with a slide like that. But my understanding is that it is at least as good from those who care about these things. So it's worth a look at least. I would just watch out for the classic proprietary bait and switch. They've already shut down all of the IRC gateways. I don't see why not. I don't see why not. I feel like we're all working on interesting things. I'm trying to post things I come across that are interesting, but obviously when there's only like 5 people signed up on the site, it's kind of slow. But you know, like I found a nice lecture by Kate. Oh, what was her name? I'll find the post. Hang on. But yeah, it was in here, I think. Yeah, here we are. Ethics, politics, AI. So I saw this. I don't like Max, but yeah. So this was a really interesting lecture. So I would recommend going and watching that about ethics of AI, and there's some really interesting examples of AI getting things really wrong. So that's worth a look. So yeah, I don't see why we can't have general chats about tech and potentially look at broadening it out from the TechMeetUp brand at some point. But like that's way. Like, let's get TechMeetUp working first, right?
Is there any requirement that you have to be like a UK resident or like kind of relevant rather than someone who has no connection to TechMeetUp is never going to go to a TechMeetUp?
Technically, anyone can sign up, but that's true of the mailing list as well. But we could potentially do that. The nice thing about something like this is that it's a web app and it takes plugins. So potentially anything is possible if you're prepared to code it, right? Or if the plugin already exists. There's plenty of tooling there for moderation. There's a fair amount of anti-spam stuff built in, automated flagging, things like that. So if there's any real issues, so that should hopefully take some load off the existing moderators because the mailing list today is fully moderated. Nothing posts without somebody testing it first, as I understand it. So that hopefully brings their workload down a little bit as well, because it's a little bit more automated.
What's the truck factor on your
Very good question. I will welcome more people. I have no interest in being a linchpin on this. It is hosted on one of my VPSs at the moment, but it's very easy to migrate. It runs in Docker. Not that I'm the biggest fan of Docker, but anyway, it makes it easy in this case. So tarring up the container and the permanent data drive and moving it somewhere else is trivial. Obviously DNS and everything else we've done as well. But I'm quite happy to have other admins help me out with that. There's no, because it's still there's still only like 5 people on it. I've not got any automated backups in, but that's easy to add because I'm doing that for my production site with Foreman, so it's not difficult for me to set that up, which I will do. I'll put it on my to-do list right now. I always say to people, if you don't see me write a task down, it's not going to happen.
Right. Well, thank you, Greg, for that. So yeah, new Shiny Forum.
Did you sign up?
I think the plan is, and at some point in the future, we're going to be moving from the mailing list to that, just because it's so much easier.
The nice thing is it's very customizable. It's not easy to show here because obviously I don't have my login on this machine, and I use really long passwords. Right? So the nice thing is that it's got full customization and CSS styling and all the rest of it. So it's quite possible to do something like what we have on the front page of the TechMeetUp site today, pulling out the latest events from the event category automatically and showing those in a banner at the top and things like that. That kind of thing is perfectly possible, which means potentially it can make automating all of that much easier as well. So that's really only an issue for us organizers, but it's a nice win if nobody else cares that much.
Right. So with that, I just remember something. Someone, after I posted the announcement for today's meetup, someone reminded me that TechMeetUp is having its 10th anniversary today. So yeah, 10 years. And I guess
time for a change, right?
Yeah. And also, I guess another announcement is that from next month onward, we're going to be moving to Codebase. To the event space, just up the road. So I think, Skyscanner have been a great host for us for many, many years. But I think, it's probably better if we, hop from place to place. Like originally, TechMeetUp started in Appleton Tower. It grew from there. It grew there for a couple of years, then moved here. And I think now it's, it's quite a good kind of time to see where else we could host it. So yeah, again, I'd like to give a big hand to Skyscanner for hosting us for so long, and I'd like to thank them for being sponsors and Skyscanner cultivating informatics ventures. And and now pub time, doctors, and hopefully we'll also see you next month.
quickly shout out, not that it's anywhere near as important as this, but I also set up a Matrix channel as well, if anyone wants in. Just because I like competing with Slack, right? I know that